2 Corinthians, if you can read the title, sort of blurred out on that one. Covering two chapters today, chapters 8 and 9. Why? Because they're related to the same topic. Oh, the title is Encouraging in the Collection. So they're related to the collection. And we'll see if we can cover a lot of that collection today. We'll be covering a little bit of it in chapter 12 as well. And that should be pretty revealing as well. Yes, we are combining two chapters today, as do our commentators Guthrie and Harris, which is not to minimize the importance of that Corinthian collection, since we also spoke of that collection not only last chapter, but last week as well. But because this topic is getting a bit tedious, as Paul himself admits in verse 1 of chapter 9. And admittedly, this is a pretty sensitive topic as well. Yep, money sensitive. So this particular study will be a comprehensive summary of what was finally realized in Corinth, along with a little personal advice for you quizzers. This is a summary of the collection that finally occurred in Corinth according to Romans 15, which was written afterwards. However minimal that collection from Corinth might have been. Seems there was only 100 believers there, according to Sjogren, remember? Regardless, this was a very substantial collection made in Macedonia, at the very least, which we read in verse 20. A huge collection of silver. It was all translated into silver, that Paul's co-workers were hauling around a collection mysteriously started by Timothy, we read in Acts 19, and a collection mysteriously completed by Titus, with some mysterious transfer of that collection between those two T's that our commentators fail to address, fail to discuss, till Paul finally went with those co-workers to present that enormous collection to Jerusalem. He went to deliver those gifts for the poor, is what we are told in Acts 24, verse 17, which is entirely consistent with what Paul was eager to do from the very beginning, which is what we read in Galatians 2, verse 10, which is also consistent with what Titus was also eager to do from the very beginning, even without the prompting of Paul. So there is no contradiction between verses 6 and 17, as you might think in this chapter, for God had already put this desire into the heart of Titus, apparently, which we read in verse 16, who was Paul's co-worker, we read in verse 23. His co-worker, despite the fact that he is nowhere mentioned in Acts. Yep, much like Timothy, or unlike Timothy, who is described as Paul's co-worker in 16:21 and is frequently mentioned in Acts, which should lead you to believe that those fellow co-workers are simply one and the same. Timothy and Titus are one and the same. There is no duplicity there. This is an argument Richard Fellows presents recently, and it's a really good argument. It's an argument that I repeated when we studied Acts 16. But who are those other guys of verse 18 and verse 22? Those other two guys who are accompanying Timothy or Titus. Well, there is another mystery for us courageous folks to tackle. Here we go. In this briefer commentary, Harris fails to speculate on those other guys, whereas Guthrie finds the first three guys listed in Acts 20, verse 4, as being the most likely candidates. Why? Because the most important guys get named first. They're not politically correct back then. They named the most important guys first. That's the nature of their culture. That's the nature of the Greek language. So he thought maybe Sopater, Pyrrhus, and Aristarchus were the three guys. However, along with Calvin, Calvin again, and Chrysostom, there's an old guy, I would consider Luke the accountant, Count Luke, and Barnabas as four more likely candidates. With Luke, who is considered to be the brother of verse 18, being a more likely candidate in order to explain this very detailed account of this journey of Paul's, which we read in Acts. And with Barnabas, our brother of verse 22, being a more likely candidate since he is the encouraging Levite who could relate well with Jews and with generosity, as we will see in chapter 12, since he had done this collection before. With the far less likely Aristarchus joining those other two guys at some point after their arrival in Jerusalem, joining a then arrested Paul on his long and winding road to Rome in Acts 27. Now, to put this collection in its proper perspective, Paul now asks those Corinthians to give proportionately, according to Guthrie, not disproportionately as those Macedonians have just done with the collection. It seems those Macedonian believers were giving to the point of becoming even more impoverished than those Jewish believers in Jerusalem. And Paul knew it. Those Macedonians were giving far beyond their ability. It is what we read in verse 3. Those Macedonians were nuts. So now I'm going to show you the precept, the principle, and the precedent for proper giving. A principle that you quizzers ought to be applying in your charitable giving in the future. When you quizzers start having something called first fruits from some sort of paying job. Now, this is an ancient precept which was proportionate rather than extravagant or egregious, as Guthrie insists. A precept that follows the Old Testament principle of tithing, of giving a tenth of your earnings back to God, which we read in Deuteronomy chapter 14, of giving a tenth, even when your greedy government was already sucking a tenth off the top, which was happening soon after 1 Samuel chapter 8. Now, this was an extremely reasonable precedent that was set by Abraham even before that precept was commanded. We read that Abraham example, that Abraham precedent in Genesis 14 and in Hebrews 7. When Abraham gave that very reasonable tithe to Melchizedek, who was in all likelihood a pre-incarnate manifestation of God. Well, what does that mean? Which is to say that Abraham gave that tithe to the Son before he took on flesh. And this tithing was a principle that functioned as an equalizer. It was an equalizing payment supporting the priestly Levites like Barnabas. Levites who were supposed to collect the tithes in all the towns where we work, according to Nehemiah chapter 10. So Barnabas would then take this payment to his fellow Jews in Jerusalem. He would once again, take this huge collection to James and all the elders, as we read in Acts 21, for them to distribute as needed. A collection that was traditionally distributed by the Levites. They were supposed to distribute this tithe to themselves, to strangers, to orphans, and widows, you read in Deuteronomy 14. With a tenth of that tithe also going to some mysterious storehouse in Nehemiah. A storehouse which was a contingency fund, a rainy day fund, which you quizzers also ought to have. A rainy day fund, much like Joseph stored prior to the great drought of Genesis 41. A storehouse that enabled him to take care of his family when the rains didn't come. Now, Another mystery regarding this tithing seems to be the idea of supporting only those within your particular town. The idea of not supporting foreign towns, as we see in that Deuteronomy verse in chapter 26. However, we see towns in the provinces of Macedonia and Achaia now supporting distant Jerusalem in this instance. So what's up with that, huh? Well, it seems that support system all changed with Jesus, with a great welcoming of the Gentiles by Jesus. That support system then became international. It all changed when Jesus said to the Gentile woman, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Whereupon the Gentile woman said, well, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Whereupon Jesus welcomed this Gentile in Mark 7. He welcomed this Gentile woman since she had great faith in his status as Lord. Great faith in his status as Savior. And this appears to be the case with Paul as well, when Paul admonishes us to do good to all people, but especially to those who belong to the family of believers, we read in chapter 6 of Galatians, which seems to indicate that the vast majority of your charity should be for Christians, however. And I suspect that the Jerusalem collection was distributed in that very sensible manner. That this charity was distributed in a family-first manner, a loving charity that should have encouraged a loving unity between Jewish and Gentile Christians. And it did encourage that. Yes, it did cause James and the elders to glorify God for the Gentiles, we read in Acts 21. Now, this collection should have given the gospel of grace and the gospel of the resurrection more than a fair hearing among the unbelieving Jews there in Jerusalem as well. But it didn't. Even though that was the intent of this collection as well, we read in 2 Corinthians 9:13. Instead, those unbelievers were likely jealous that they were not getting as much of the collection as believers were. And as a result, the gospel of grace was then quickly challenged by the Pharisees in Acts 21, while the gospel of the resurrection was then quickly challenged by the Sadducees in Acts 23, which resulted in Paul getting beaten and shackled by the Jews once again, beaten and shackled within a week, despite the shekels that he had just brought to them. However, this beating should not discourage you quizzers from taking part in tithing in the least. Rather, like Paul, you should be encouraged to continue to tithe due to the eternal rewards that may result from this tithing. Yep, those eternal rewards mentioned in chapter 3 of that other letter. But also due to temporal rewards. Rewards in which you might also be supported by others during pretty rough times. Sort of like life insurance or welfare or government pension or workman's comp. Stuff that they didn't have way back then. But that present day stuff doesn't eliminate the need for present day charity, even if it does reduce it somewhat. And that is the intent of the statement in verses 13 and 14, that there might be equality. Not that Paul was a communist or a Marxist, as some might suggest. No, not at all. Not that he was willing, not that he thought that everyone ought to have the exact same amount. On the contrary, Paul insisted that the one who is unwilling to work shall not eat. He said that in 2 Thessalonians. A principle that would disqualify a great many people, including numerous beggars. Rather, Paul was supporting much more modest relief efforts in that respect, such as a master might owe to his servant, according to Calvin. But more so, relief efforts in that family first manner, as mentioned above, with less effort expended on non-family. Relief efforts which resulted in those having very, very much, not to have too much, and those having very little, not to have too little, which we read in verse 15. What does that mean? What Paul's saying there? Well, here Paul is referring to an event where manna rained down from heaven for 40 years. Yes, manna rained down. Food rained down while Israel was wandering around in that wilderness of sin. That wilderness that Paul keeps obsessing about in Exodus 16. So, when those that gathered only a little manna for their family in the wilderness did not have too little, we read. And those that gathered too much for their family in the wilderness found the excess that they gathered full of maggots the following day. Too bad for their greed. Yep, too bad for their unfaithfulness. Which is not to say that wealth is all that bad. After all, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were wealthy. Sometimes wealth is better for some folks, and sometimes it's not. As Jesus said, what good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Yeah, even if you gain only part of the world, do you think your soul will be better off? Well, do you think that it will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness that we read in verse 10? Well, do you think it's going to make you a better person in the least? Well, you don't know that. Just think again of all the happy people, all the righteous people with far, far less, and just think of the vast unrighteousness of many with far, far more. However, if it just so happens that you do have a little left over, then you will be blessed if you share it with the needy. Not sharing it as a result of sad feelings or of pressure, as Paul insists in chapter 9, verse 7. Not sharing as a result of undue emotions, which are most often the case, but rather sharing as a result of a well-reasoned case. A well-considered case. A case that Paul gave the city of Corinth lots and lots of time to consider. Yes, over a year to consider. To consider the well-reasoned case that of God sharing such a wise investment back with you. Even if that return on investment only comes back to you in eternity. And last but not least, your charity will provoke many prayers for you, we read in verse 14. Prayers from those receiving your charity. Yep. So, may you, generous quizzers, be blessed by many, many prayers as you bless various others with many, many of your first fruits. For God, yes, has given you his first fruits. He has given you Jesus. And is that generous enough? Does that sound reasonable for you? Yeah. Okay, good. Dear Father, thank you for giving us first fruits. May we share them with others just as you shared your first fruits with us. Amen.